Hello, everyone. Today I'm joined by Matt Segall. Matt's been on the podcast before. We had a great conversation about Whitehead and process philosophy and process theology. Matt is a brilliant thinker, transdisciplinary researcher, writer, teacher, and philosopher, applying process relational thought across the natural and social sciences, as well as to the study of consciousness. He's an associate professor in the philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness program at California Institute of Integral Studies in San Francisco, and as well as the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for the Cobb Institute, our dear friends over at the Process Thought Center there. Got some other friends there. And first things first, thanks, Matt. I'll set this up in a second, but before we get into it, thanks for being on the podcast again.
Yeah, really happy to be here and for the invitation. Thanks, Brendan.
Yeah, of course. So, all right. So I'm going to try to set this up. And so this conversation came out of some stuff that you'd posted, that we got into this sort of preliminary conversation. It seemed like it would be the subject matter for a rich discussion. And it's also been something that I've been seeing increasingly in sort of this broader scene that I'm aware of, in terms of this metamodern, integral, adjacent, liminal web scene of, what I'm thinking of specifically, you've got cosmoerotic humanism, which is like Zach Stein and Mark Gafni doing that. You've got people interested in Steiner, Rudolf Steiner's work, and people interested in process thought. You're very interested in Whitehead. And it seems like there's an interesting way in which a lot of these particular sort of elements of the conversation are converging towards a very different kind of, let's say, answer or response to our current situation regarding, let's say, the nature of the meaning crisis and the issue around kind of situating the human in relation to the cosmos, which is how I would try to frame this a little bit. So big picture, what I would say, and then I'll set this up and then you can agree or correct it or whatever, refine it. I tend to think of like the religious function as being that which sort of connects the individual human with the cosmic order of things, and to do that in some sort of meaningful way, that there is a deep connection. Now, with the advent of modernity and sort of modern science, that connection largely gets severed because the individual comes to feel alienated from this sort of vast cosmos and the sort of reductionistic, materialistic framework, clockwork universe, etc. And so a lot of the work around the meaning crisis is sort of diagnosed to that aspect. And then a lot of the sort of issue is, well, what do we do about that? Now, I have my own notions of like the direction to go. And what I've been really interested in is that there's this alternative approach, which again, I see cropping up in these places that I just named, which seem to be attending to the same problem, but approaching it from a very different way. And then it's just a matter of starting to have more of these conversations, discussions, and debates so that we can kind of get clear about what people are saying and why, and really get into it. So I get the sense that this alternative approach, or what for me is alternative, this way that that you're discussing and espousing, is sort of a way of relating the human being to the cosmos in such a manner as the human being is sort of the lens through which to understand the cosmos, let's say. And maybe I won't say any more because I don't want to, preempt any of this. So maybe I'll let you try to express what this perspective is, and then I'll try to bounce some off some contrast and comparison, and then we'll kind of get into it. So yeah, give a little exposition about this orientation towards reality, really.
I think that's a great setup, Brendan. So I think the big challenge right now, and one which metamodernism is trying to engage with, and the process community is trying to engage with, and all these other communities interested in what's next are trying to engage in, is how do we get science and religion and or spirituality to enter into a different kind of dialogue with each other. They both seem using these huge abstract categories, science, religion, broadly speaking, they both seem to be essential to a fulfilling human life. We need meaning and we need knowledge. And we need not just meaning, we need a sense of what is of value an orientation to the good and a set of prescriptions for how we can achieve the good life, how we can be good people, and knowledge of how nature works is often very important for that. Right. So we need science, we need religion. Totally on board with that. I think the issue for me is in regard to modern science and the extent to which the Cartesian mechanistic view of science has kind of won out, and that many times even those who want to challenge the Cartesian legacy end up still having some residues of Cartesian dualism and of a sense that nature is just mechanistic, and that that the scientific revolution necessarily leads into this alienation of the subject from a mechanized collection of objects. And I think to heal that rift, it might be that we need more than just a different kind of culture. It might actually, or a different approach to the humanities, so that we can make meaning out of the mechanistic picture of nature that science has given us. I would say we can and need to actually revisit the image of nature that this Cartesian and even residually Cartesian form of naturalism has left us with, and ask if there is an alternative approach to science, which is in many ways no less modern, but it is inheriting the Romantic tradition in a way. And I know there's certain criticisms that would rightly need to be addressed if we're going to try to revitalize Romanticism. But I think, as Owen Barfield put it, Romanticism can come of age, and there are resources to draw upon from the last few hundred years of romantic or organic scientists who have developed rigorous methods and alternative approaches that surface and foreground the qualitative dimensions of the natural world that a predominantly quantitative and mechanizing approach to science has backgrounded or completely ignored, or relegated to subjective projections, mere secondary qualities, what have you. And we can recover this alternative approach to natural science in a way that doesn't require jettisoning all of the boons that came with the mechanistic, or I should say the calculative methods and the mechanistic models and the technological payoffs of all that. I mean, all that's great. I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation without the payoffs of this mechanistic approach. But it's important, I think, to revisit the history of science and just look at all the ways in which, particularly in the 20th century, that old mechanistic materialistic model of the cosmos has been demolished by science, right? Following the scientific method has allowed us to overcome a sense of the universe as just a collection of mechanically interacting bits of matter, right? That is no longer a scientific image of what the universe is up to, right? And so I guess it seems to me that where our tension may be arising has to do with whether the issue of making meaning in a meta-modern way is possible without revising and reimagining the scientific conception of nature and our conception of science itself and the scientific method.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. But I mean, so all right. So now let's get into it, though, because I like everything you just said, I would more or less agree with, I suppose. But then it's sort of the devil's in the details, right? Now, I think this conversation is going to be really interesting because it's very fundamental. Like most conversations I have with people on this podcast, there's sort of a presumed sort of metaphysical landscape that we're operating in, and then we'll kind of, disagree at various levels, more superficial levels within that, and debate certain things. But I see the kind of change in perspective that you're advocating from within this tradition as being like sort of an epistemological revolution. I mean, it's an inversion in many ways of what a lot of people take as given. And that's why I've been so intrigued by these ideas, because they are so on the face of it, you hear these thoughts and then you're like, what? How could that possibly be? And I'm always taken too. I mean, we're always adjudicating, we're kind of weighting, like giving weight to different truth claims that we see in culture and from different people based on a whole host of factors, right? And so, if my crazy drunk uncle at Thanksgiving starts saying things about, like maybe we actually, it is a geocentric model or something like that, it's sort of like, all right, well, context determines how seriously they take that. But when you find people who are super intelligent and very well read, engaging with deep philosophical material in a very kind of nuanced and subtle, sophisticated way, and then saying these, sort of very, advocating for a totally different conception of reality, then it lands differently, and you have to kind of be like, okay, this is, and it's weighted differently. So I wanted just to kind of make those couple points because it's sort of like, I have a lot of respect for you as a thinker, and I mean, some of the people that you're drawing on in this broader conversation, people like Steiner and Whitehead and Goethe are like, these are intellectual giants, right? So we'd be foolish to just, well, they're saying something that's different from, consensus views, so let's just reject it. So I wanted to just sort of name all that, and also as sort of a context for, it'll be interesting to see if we can get really into the heart of the matter without, because there's so much sort of excavation you have to do just to kind of really start to have these, to get there. It is sort of like a conversation between I don't know, sort of like a materialist empiricist and like an idealist, who are just sort of like, these are inverse sort of orientations to the nature of understanding reality. So all that said, we'll see how well we can succeed in that endeavor.
Yeah.
But explain this a bit. So I'll put it into some words, and then you tell me, what I'm missing and how you would add to it. But one of the core ideas here that I'm seeing is that looking at nature and trying to sort of generate abstract models using mathematics and using geometry and sort of sort of mathematical thought to create these abstracted concepts of how the world operates sort of out there, as it were, kind of free from, like a reality without humans. Let's say, like you go into interstellar space and you're talking about the orbits of planets and stars and this sort of thing. It is a very kind of just abstract, very inhumane or non-human sort of world that we're talking about. And what you're suggesting is that that is misguided, because we are, and then I guess the because is something I'm missing, but the argument would be something like, we need to use our phenomenological reality as the sort of best grounding for what we know to be true, right? So you talk about theories of relativity and quantum physics, and these are just so alien to the sorts of reality that we experience as human beings, but they're abstract models. And so rather than do what I think most people tend to do, which is like, like there's a whole other aspect to reality that we, in our particular bubble of being at our particular scale and having the particular senses that we do, are just sort of missing out and blind to. You're saying that there's something probably wrong with those models, essentially. So it's a kind of inverted approach to that. So that's just a trying to set this up to get how people get their heads around this issue. And then I hope people can start to intuit some of the big questions that would arise from this. Like, do we conform to this reality that we're abstracting into these mathematical scientific models, or do we use our senses in our kind of common sense even to kind of determine that if we get a certain answer kind of mathematically or scientifically that's against our sense perceptions, that should be evidence to sort of discount it. So that's sort of that. I'm just trying to set this up, but maybe you can unpack some of this more.
Yeah, I think that's great. I wouldn't want to come off as suggesting that I am just championing common sense over and against the advances of science and the weirding of what we thought the world was like. I think it's very important for our common sense intuitions and our scientific experimentation and development of hypotheses, and the advance of that sort of inquiry to be in a kind of dialectical interplay with one another. And common sense sometimes does need to evolve. And we're in the situation we are in today because of how profoundly science has transformed our common sense, and there's no going back. I'm totally in agreement with the sense in which if we want to make meaning, if we want to find some way of restoring a spiritual connection to the cosmos, we're going to need to grapple with the best scientific evidence that is available and square our sense of what is possible for human beings and for our pursuit of meaning with that evidence and that knowledge base. But I think the issue is that the overall picture of a mechanistic worldview, let's call it, which many individual scientists actually totally reject, or would say, well, there's the worldview of science, and then there's actually just the very messy, difficult work of doing scientific research, which is full of uncertainties and probabilities, and like how that connects to a worldview is a whole big issue. But we're in a situation where, for educated people, the mechanistic worldview is still more or less dominant. There is an emerging sector of people who are interested in integral theory or metamodernism or cosmoerotic humanism or whatever, who are exploring alternatives. But more or less, for modern Western people, we have this mechanistic worldview that is justified by reference to the power of science. And I think the issue for me is that picture of the universe makes the possibility of intelligent organisms with consciousness and agency and so on, such as ourselves, impossible. Or at least, if not impossible, highly, highly unlikely, right? And so we're in a situation where we as human beings capable of doing this advanced scientific reasoning and research and experimentation, building these magnificent multi-billion-dollar instruments that we send into space or put under Switzerland or whatever, and we're using all that instrumentation to develop this elaborate model of the universe wherein we should not exist, right? In other words, where what's ultimately real is just this interplay of particles or disturbances in fields that are totally non-conscious, non-purposive, and the fact that life and intelligence have emerged on this one planet just becomes a kind of cosmic fluke, total anomaly. I think there's a epistemological rug that we're pulling out from under our feet when we make claims like that. And so, from my point of view, as a philosopher, we have to first establish the metaphysical presuppositions of science. We are in a universe where conscious, agential, purposive organisms exist that are capable of doing science. Okay, so baked into any scientific explanation we could have of nature is the fact that science is that scientists exist, right? And so it's an epistemological presupposition of science. I think Immanuel Kant's whole transcendental revolution, speaking of epistemological revolutions, kind of already set the scene for this, a few centuries ago. And in many ways, we're living in the aftermath of Kant, grappling with what he laid out. Even if we disagree with him, everyone's responding to Kant in the last few hundred years. And I like to follow the initial reaction to Kant from, Schelling and Goethe and, Fichte and Hegel as well. But there was a sense in which Kant laid out this new problematic where we recognized the fact that we as subjects are constructing, we're involved in an active way in constructing the knowledge that we have of nature. And it's not that there's not a nature out there. Even Kant said, there's a real world out there, but what we know about it is totally a function of our own categories of understanding, our own forms of intuition, right? And I think the post-Kantian idealists in Germany recognized the instability of this Kantian compromise, I sometimes call it. Like, we can't ultimately end with this sense of a subject constructing the world, because we know there's a world out there. And I really like Schelling's flip, where he asks, rather than the Kantian question, which is, what must the mind be like such that nature could appear to us in the way that it does? Schelling asks the inverse question, which is, what must nature be like such that mind could have emerged from it, so that we could be here asking these questions, right? Mm-hmm. And from that inversion of Kant, I think you run straight into this alternative form of science, organic science, romantic science, however you want to describe it, participatory science, where we're looking at nature as though we as subjects were part of it, instead of the Cartesian thing, where it's like, no, we can explain nature as though the human wasn't involved at all. There's no subjectivity. It's just objects. And I don't think that actually works to do it that way. I think that's actually, in that attempt to be, to decenter the human so much, we end up doing an injustice to the phenomena of nature, because we're part of nature.
So most of the time, I think when you are speaking in critical terms, I'm, again, in total agreement with you, which is why I find this really interesting, because I feel like we're on parallel paths in terms of diagnosing so much of the problem. And then, and this is good, because this sets up now, I think we're starting to get into these sort of alternative solutions to the problem, where I see this juncture happen. Now, in my view, so granting all that you're saying, again, with, let's say 99% of which I agree with, I just see it as in one response to this is that this whole mechanistic, reductionistic, sort of shift into modern science can be seen as a transitional phase where, yes, a lot of misunderstanding crept into our worldview, and a lot of oversimplistic notions of some fundamental metaphysical concepts arose. But I guess here's how I would frame it, and I'm sure you would disagree with this, but here's how it keeps landing for me, is that I see that as something we need to go through, and we go through it by getting to things like complexity science, where we actually do start to appreciate all the ways that basically once you go through mechanistic thought, you get to this other side where you see that there are emergent properties that emerge from basically mechanisms that give rise to novel layers of reality. And then you can see that there are different sort of scale invariant processes that lead to the evolution of organic agential living entities, and then agential conscious entities, and then agential conscious language endowed conceptual entities, but that this is a continuum that is sort of like, the way I would look at it is that physics, the kind of, I think what you're the kind of epistemology that you're describing is very much that of sort of like just fundamental physics, but obviously we also have things like biology, and we also have things like sociology, and when we start to connect those forms of knowing, we see this continuum, and we can see that very minimally complex phenomena, which admittedly most of the known universe is very amenable to sort of mechanistic science, but once you start getting more and more complex entities, then the sort of like simple equations and abstract mathematics begin to no longer be sufficient, and you need increasingly mathematical models and ideas and concepts informed by increasingly nonlinear and sort of unpredictable understandings of things, and the understanding that that using the sort of building blocks of this sort of crude mechanism, that itself can lead towards the emergence of all the stuff that you're describing, which is, the scientist who's looking at the world and making sense of it. And so for me, I don't see these as being in fundamental conflict in the same way that it's sort of like, in order to become, a PhD, I have to first do my undergraduate, right? And so what I know in my undergraduate phase is going to be cruder and simpler and less sophisticated and nuanced than what I'm going to learn in my PhD, doctoral dissertation, and beyond, right? But I have to pass through my undergraduate in order to get there. Now, I see, and again, here's the framing I think they would probably very much disagree with. I see this alternative turn as basically saying, this knowledge that we are finding in our undergraduate years is not, there's big problems with it. Let's basically abort and go back to a way of thinking that's much more intuitive and embodied and sort of common sense oriented, and using the individual sort of assimilation processes and schemas of the mind to interpret reality, and giving them additional credibility as a sort of reactionary move, basically, because there's this concern that if we keep going in this direction, we're just going to become more and more alienated. So that's what I keep seeing. But I also, I very much presume that I'm missing something very profound there, because, these are important ideas, and they're clearly compelling to quality minds like yourself in a way that I'm not just trying to say, Matt Segall, he's a regressive reactionary or something, right? So I think there's a deep really crucial way of trying to grapple with these ideas. But I do think that this issue is so huge, because this juncture that I see occurring at the moment that, depending on what direction we go, I think that we're going to get very different responses to the issue of sort of modern alienation and mechanism. And I think some of those are better responses than others. So yeah, I don't know. Any thoughts on any of that?
I definitely agree with you that there is a developmental pathway here, and that going through the sort of mechanistic disenchantment is essential. And, thinkers from Charles Taylor to Rudolf Steiner have described the modern transformation as a result of the scientific revolution driving a moral transformation. Steiner would say that the scientific revolution and the rise of this mechanistic worldview was important in the evolution of consciousness for the cultivation of human freedom, because we couldn't just be enchanted with the external cosmos and have the wisdom fed to us like an umbilical cord, from this world soul or whatever. Like, no, we needed to individuate and feel like the universe had nothing for us, so that we could cultivate this sense of an I, the first person pronoun, and freedom, which had very important political ramifications. The ancient cosmology and the stratified, hierarchical, patriarchal social structures were intimately related, and what Eric Voegelin would call a compact cosmology. And so the rise of modern science, the disenchantment of the world, comes right alongside the rise of a new kind of individual consciousness and this value of freedom, and all of that is absolutely essential, right? And so we do need to go through this materialist phase of disenchantment and alienation. But when we come through and out the other side to complexity science and an understanding of emergence and so on, I think it's not just mechanism plus. It's a reevaluation of mechanism as always having been a partial explanation, even of physics. Okay? Like, self-organization goes all the way down. Self-organization used to be, Kant recognized this in the critique of judgment. It used to be thought of something as something that's unique to the biological world. And for Kant, recognizing self-organization in the biological world, it made very clear to him, as he put it, there could never be a Newton of the grass blade, there could not be a mechanistic explanation, in other words, of even a mere blade of grass, because there's a whole to part causality operative in the living world that, on a Newtonian understanding of what the physical world is not there, where it's just parts outside of parts banging into each other. But the way that 20th century physics has played out, complexity, emergence, self-organization, that goes all the way down to fundamental particle physics. We're talking about emergent self-organizing systems. An atom is not just a little hard BB that exists for all eternity. Like, there's a process of development and emergence out of which atoms emerged, out of which atoms came to be what they are. So yeah, it's not just, I think the shift to complexity science, an understanding of hierarchical emergence in nature. That to me is not just mechanism plus. I think that I would affirm that as the right direction to move, but it's a more organic conception of nature. And the last thing I want to add is, using this terms from developmental psychology like assimilation and accommodation, I think is great. A wonderful example here would be to compare Goethe and Newton in their approach to studying color. You might initially think that Goethe was, by relying on intuition or whatever, being more in the assimilative mode, making nature conform to his own common sense experience of color phenomena. But actually, if you get into the methodologies here and what Goethe's actual argument was, I would say it's Newton who's more assimilative and Goethe who's more accommodating of the phenomena themselves, in the sense that Newton's arriving at his experience of color with multiple prisms in a dark room, through a pinhole, with a hypothesis already in mind. He has his geometrical account and he wants to get the phenomena to conform to it. Okay, he has his idea in mind and he wants to assimilate nature to his idea, to his model. Goethe, on the other hand, is taking prisms, building all sorts of other contraptions to refract light in different ways, and running through as many different experiments as he possibly could. Newton wanted the one crucial experiment that would prove his hypothesis and his geometric model. Goethe said, it's like stocking the pond with fish in advance. It's like you can't lead with your hypothesis or your model and get the phenomena to conform to it and ignore any phenomena that don't conform to it. If you read the color theory that Goethe articulates, he goes, there are, countless different experimental situations that he puts himself in and observes how color phenomena change in those different circumstances. And his theory of color emerges from the interplay of all the phenomena, all of the experimental conditions that he can collect, right? And so he's really trying to accommodate himself to the phenomena rather than impose an idea on the phenomena. And so I think if we have a proper understanding of what this alternative scientific method looks like that takes qualitative experience seriously, in addition to, it's not an either or thing, it's in addition to mathematical quantitative analysis. It's not simply an assimilative, I want nature to make me feel good type of approach.
Well, yeah. So, all right. There's a couple quotes I want to read from your article in a second. But then before that, I had a question, and then based on what you just said, I have sort of a different question, real quick, or maybe just a brief response, which is like I don't know. That just seems to be sort of redefining what we mean by assimilation and accommodation, in a sense of like, what Newton was doing was trying to, distill a phenomenon into a kind of, simple, elegant model that I guess puts us in the position, at the very least, to have to say, well, is modern color theory wrong? Like for example, it's a fact that in a beam of white light, all the colors exist, right? And that was part of what I believe goes back to some of the things that Newton showed, was that you could then, do the prism and basically break light into its parts. But when I look at a beam of white light, it doesn't look like there's green and blue and red in there, right? So this will make a little bit more sense after I read some of these quotes to try to give people a bit of a better sense of what this methodology entails, right? But like in my mind, in a very simplistic way that I'm feeling like I'm not getting the complexity of the argument here, it would seem like, well, Newton was right, because when you do the prism thing, it breaks into all this stuff, and then you can work with color this way, and it does inform our mechanistic worldview and the technology that we use, etc. If this sort of more perceptual, participatory, intuitive approach is used, it's like, no, that's just white light, and then you need a different theory, so it seems like trying to precisely decenter us from our normal way of interpreting reality and getting beyond that into a different conception is accommodating to reality as it is, not just assimilating to a given theory, because the theory itself is rather unusual and doesn't fit our natural intuitions and perceptions. So it seems like, yeah. So do you know what I mean? Like that. I don't know if you have any quick responses to a response, but
I mean, it's a very complicated issue. The answer to your initial question is Newton's theory of color wrong? Well, I mean, very quite literally, yes, because he denied the wave theory of light. But and then he was thinking in terms of corpuscular,
right.
Different colored pieces of light. But so literally, yes, it is wrong, but not because of Goethe's arguments in terms of what's widely accepted. But the general idea that our experience of color corresponds to certain wavelengths of light is actually a pretty highly contested term or claim by cognitive scientists and people who aren't just looking at the physics but looking at human perception and the eye and the ecological contextual situations in which a wavelength that a machine would measure actually doesn't appear to us in the way that one would expect if it was just a simple causal relationship. And Goethe's experiments with color show this quite clearly, that in actual life there is almost never a one-to-one correspondence between wavelength and our perception of color. And I'm tempted. I'll recommend a couple of books here. Dennis Sepper wrote a book on Goethe and Newton, Goethe's polemic, and there's a whole polemical section of his color theory that engages with Newton's approach. And it's, Goethe's usually a well sort of balanced, not overly reactive emotional person, but for whatever reason, he just hated Newton's approach to the study of color and hated the Newtonians in his time who were approaching color in that way. And he really wanted to distinguish between optics and chromatics, right? Optics, where geometry is very relevant, and chromatics, where it's more about our experience of color. And to really understand color, Goethe thought that Newton's approach was doing great violence to the phenomena, right?
Just real quick. So that's something I can totally get behind, right? But that's a differentiation that needs to be made. And then we're saying, oh, we're actually talking about different things, right? Where it's like, if you're just trying to explain a certain kind of mechanistic causal relationship at a very rudimentary level, then sure, Newtonian optics or something, right? But then on the other hand, if you're trying to do something more like what Goethe is doing, which is focusing on the phenomenology of color and focusing on the subject in relation to those rudimentary mechanics, then you would need a lot more. And I would still argue that that's still mechanical, but you would just need to build in, now you're doing a interface with a phenomenon, and then you need to have the mechanics of the human mind, basically. So then it is getting into things like neuroscience as opposed to just sort of
what do you mean by mechanism? Can you
yeah, I mean, like
define mechanism for me?
I mean, just like that a thing causes another thing, that there's a direct causal relationship in a way that can be sort of shown to be the case. So
externally related parts in some sort of a kinetic causal relationship forces.
And it doesn't have to be kinetic. I mean, like, so there's a great book, Context Changes Everything. I was just reading a couple months ago. Yeah, which is excellent. So like, it doesn't have to be kinetic. It doesn't have to be efficient cause. It can be constraints.
Does Hararo refer to these I mean, when she brings in formal causality and final causality and still refers to this as mechanism?
I don't know. I don't recall if she uses that word or not, but I'm not married to the term mechanism. What I mean, though, is that there's a direct causal relationship between these two things occurring, and I think that to use like a crude or a basic analogy, right? If I have a pendulum and I pick it up this way, it's going to come down and it's going to do that, and it's going to hit the thing. And then if I try to say what caused the thing, what caused this to be hit, I could say, oh, it was the pendulum who hit the thing. Or if you put a ball on an inclined plane, it's going to roll down and it's going to have an impact down on the floor. And then you can say, what has an impact on yeah, that's what I mean by mechanism, is that, like, I do believe that and then we start getting into a philosophical issue here, but I do believe that the human body is a material object that has a series of mechanisms in it that do work in mechanical ways that have causal influences in a particular direction. My kidney does a certain thing, my heart does a certain thing. It's like, what's the mechanism of pumping blood and moving oxygen through the heart? This is a very simplistic, obviously. I'm being, I have to be for the sake of the time confines of our conversation, very kind of reductionistic here, but like then we'd say it's the heart. Now obviously then you start taking in, and here's my point, is that then you can take in more and more causal relationships, and that's where you start getting beyond simple reductionistic mechanism and into complexity, where it's like, oh, the butterfly flaps its wings and then causes a hurricane over here. That's a causal mechanistic relationship. It just has so many mechanistic variables that are almost, if not in theory, impossible to predict and to measure, that we don't see it that way. But I'm committed to the notion of there being cause and effect and sort of mechanical influence, and in a way that that would be the basic claim. So then for me it's sort of like, all right, well, let's marry Newtonian optics to Goethean sort of chromatics, and then you can get a kind of synthesis where you're seeing that there's a subjective component to this thing. So that would be the claim, and you're welcome to respond to that. But I was going to ask you this different question first, and maybe they'll relate.
Okay.
Which is this. So you're a Whiteheadian philosopher, and one of the ideas of Whitehead is the crucial role that novelty plays, right, in the sort of unfolding of the cosmos, essentially. So that's kind of core to his metaphysics. So if you grant novelty, that there are always new things coming into being, which I fervently believe, and I would say that, I think there's some really important connections to be made between Whiteheadian notions of novelty and what we see in cosmic evolution and complexification. Then it means that at a certain time, there's a thing that didn't exist in the past, and hence the definition new and novel, right? And so given the importance of novelty, my contention would be that this approach that sort of privileges the human subjective instrument as a scientific organ is using a particular level of novelty and sort of retroactively, projecting it backwards into before where it didn't exist. And that would be the contention. And I'm framing that in Whiteheadian terms because I'm trying to see what you would make of that argument, which is that I find this problematic because we might be using it's sort of like if something happens in the year 2000, it's like, oh, the Bush becomes president or something, right? And then we try to use that as somehow like, okay, we can understand the entire universe through the fact that George Bush became president. It's like, well, wait a second, no, there are novel events. And so I would say that a human consciousness is like an emergence of novelty in the universe. So why should we use that novel entity, or reality rather, as the basis through which we understand all aspects of reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me go back for a second though to this issue of mechanism.
Yeah.
And in my own work, I distinguish between mechanism and organism, because I think, and here I follow people like Robert Rosen, the theoretical biologist, who developed a formal argument about self-organizing, self-producing biological systems. That he said that, look, these are not mechanistic systems. That you can't develop a sort of Turing machine computable model of what an organism does because of the recursivity that's involved.
Well, wait, maybe could you just say what you mean by mechanism? Because maybe we're just talking past each other. Because
sure. When I refer to something that's mechanical, it's purely efficient causes, externally related parts, right? That they're just given. That you don't ask where do these parts come from. They're just there. They collide with each other and exchange forces, and the parts can sometimes, add up to something more complicated, not complex, complicated. But never in a mechanical system would you get anything like downward causation, which would
Right.
be final causation.
Okay.
So mechanical systems, no formal causation, no final causation, purely efficient causation. And the question of the material cause, where did these parts come from? You can't ask that if you just want to deal with mechanism.
Well, then, so let's jettison that word just because I want to be on the same page here. And so I was
Okay.
using that term to convey a certain idea, but clearly it's loaded with, other baggage I don't want to bring in. Because I would agree, like, obviously organisms don't work that way. But I do think that I would say organisms are still mechanistic in the sense that they have causal elements.
Well, sure, I can raise my arm because the tendons and the muscles are
Sure,
mechanistic, but that's a subset of a larger organic process.
Yeah.
Let's say. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, or I'm not sure if what you were still going to say applies. If
I'll get to this novelty question. It's a very important question and well phrased and well posed. But I'm curious. So you do. I mean, you've written a book on emergence. I assume you think that there is something like downward causation in the case of a human organism or any organism.
I do. Yeah.
Okay. Good. So, just on that point, though, I would say that to reincorporate the idea of formal and final causality into naturalism or a scientific conception of nature has profound consequences.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a very interesting conversation to ask. Well, what are the consequences of doing that? And can we still call that a mechanistic conception? And I don't want to just play with words and get hung up on how we define words or whatever, but I think it matters culturally what words we choose here. But let's put that to the side for a sec and talk about this novelty question.
And just real quick, I will say in agreement with you, like I do think that the future of physics is going to bring back something like formal and final cause, and it's already doing that. You read work like Terence Deacon, right? And the issue of teleology, definitely. I mean, you can't avoid it. So I think we're on the same page on that front.
Yeah. And now, when it comes to the novelty of consciousness, I do follow Whitehead here in actually having a somewhat deflationary account of consciousness, which I do think is rather rare and special and requires a great deal of biological complexity. But Whitehead distinguishes between consciousness and experience, which for him is a technical term. He also uses feeling, and he's borrowing terms in our common parlance, which are sometimes equated with consciousness. But when Whitehead says experience or feeling, he does have a neologism here, prehension. That he thinks is fundamental and basic. He doesn't think that there could even be efficient causality without some form of prehension or feeling, which is to say that, in Whitehead's way of thinking, an efficient cause or an exchange of a force from the past into the present is a form of feeling. This is a prehension and has a vector, and it moves from the past into the present and into the future. And so that for Whitehead, to even make sense of a causal nexus and a causal relationship, we already are presupposing prehension in his terms, which at a more complex, evolved level, we human beings experience as memory. The past is present in us, right? Because of this conveyance of feeling from the past. And metaphysics to some extent is like all sciences. Whitehead says metaphysics needs an experimental apparatus, an instrument. Unlike the special sciences, which might have telescopes or microscopes or what have you, metaphysics has language itself. We're experimenting on the instrument of language in search of generalizations which apply across all the special sciences and all of human experience, religion, literature, art, morality. And so when he tries to understand what does go all the way down, he doesn't want to say human consciousness or anything like thought, the sort of agency and self-reflexivity that we have goes all the way down. No, but a basic form of feeling where there's a inheritance of the past and an anticipation of the future, and that whenever we're talking about a concrete entity in nature, he calls them actual occasions, there's always going to be this that entity is always going to be existing in tension between past and future, right? And that he thinks the best way to describe what that tension is like is to invoke feeling, right? And there's some basic fundamental prehensive or affective or aesthetic dimension to causal processes at all scales. And when the biological when these processes evolve and have adapted to the environment over the course of millions of years, billions of years, these feelings can enter into contrast with one another through complex physiology and become conscious. And we can get into exactly what his definition of consciousness is in that context. But I think people like Terence Deacon have criticized Whitehead for proposing what he calls a homuncular explanation for consciousness. It's like, well, it's very difficult to explain, so let's just implant it at the base level, and then we don't need to explain it anymore. And I think that I can understand the resistance, but at the same time, why presuppose materialism, where mind would have to come out of something, or feeling, subjectivity of any kind, that's of any intensity or degree, would have to come out of something that's fundamentally lacking in that. It's just pure object, no interiority. That's a rather difficult problem to solve, right? And so
Well, just a couple thoughts. One is, so this is another element where I feel like this is why it's such a fundamental metaphysical issue that we're grappling with here, and why, depending on certain presumptions or axiomatic conclusions, by what do you call that? Contradiction in terms.
Contradiction,
Based on, let's just say, different presumptions, you'll lead to these very different conclusions down the road. And the fundamental nature of, if not consciousness, then some kind of a feeling, first person, whatever language we want to use for that element, is definitely a component of this. And so I would love to spend some time in on its own terms, because that's its own conversation, but it's certainly informing this whole conversation. But I feel like we won't be able to do that its full justice. So maybe we can, just acknowledge that is a kind of key sort of metaphysical aspect of this conversation that, depending on how you come down on that issue, I think does inform the direction that you take. Just a quick question though that I have is Whitehead's notion of prehension, is it just a postulate, or does he give a series of reasons and logical philosophical arguments for that?
It's an inductive generalization from our knowledge of physics, our knowledge of psychology, and our knowledge of biology. He's inductively generalizing from the available evidence across all these special sciences, and so his idea of prehension is really his account of causality. Yeah. And if you look at the literature in the philosophy of science about what exactly is causation, it's quite vexing, a difficult, challenging issue to resolve. And I think it's challenging to resolve because of this bifurcation of nature between subjective experience and objective existence. And what Whitehead's able to do, or what he attempts to do, is to say that, look, subject and object are phases in a process, and you can't have one without the other ever, anywhere. Yeah. Right. And so the challenge then becomes describing subjectivity in a way that's not overly anthropocentric. Yeah. Right. And I think we can do that because the inverse issue is being anthropomorphic. You could say you're anthropomorphic by projecting subjectivity all the way down, but on the other hand, you could be anthropocentric by saying that only human beings have experience, subjectivity, consciousness. Right.
And I would say those are both extremes that we don't have to, once we can appreciate that there is one sort of a punctuated equilibrium of emergent phenomena, and two, still continuity and sort of a gradation, a spectrum that also persists there. You get discontinuity and continuity. I feel like, either of those extremes don't have to be our only options. We can recognize that there can be,
And just one more thing to say, like, sure. Consciousness or subjectivity in general, experience in general, is not just like another biological trait that might have evolved at some point. It's not just like another sense organ or, you know, another type of claw or beak or something. I think it's at a different category. It's like for evolution to work smoothly, and this is like William James's argument, like for the mutations that occur spontaneously that didn't involve any agency to then be selected for, there needs to be some agency in the organism. I mean, even to understand like the one form of purpose and, you know, agency and subjectivity that Darwin will grant to organisms or neo-Darwinians is that they want to survive. There's this desire to survive. Okay, well that's granting quite a bit actually, you know, and that's not explained by the mechanism of natural selection. It's presupposed by it, right? And so to get evolution to work, you need some more selective agency than just well, those organisms happen to survive, because otherwise evolution by natural selection turns into a tautology. And I don't want to sound like a creationist here because I know they use that argument, but to say that the organisms that currently exist because they existed in the past and have survived is kind of like, okay,
yeah,
well, they, you know,
Bobby Azarian addresses that actually in his book. Have you read The Romance of Reality?
I haven't yet.
I
No.
also highly recommend it. And yeah, so there's an interesting argument there. So if you will grant me this, maybe can we revisit this topic on its own terms some other time? Because
Sure.
you'd be someone I'd love to talk to about really trying to wrap my head around a non-anthropocentric notion of what is meant by, you know, subjective prehension, let's say. This I think is something that definitely needs to be parsed out because one, if it's an idea that's supposed to, you know, do some work, then we should have some clarity about what we really mean by it. But two, I also see a lot of slippage, because what happens in the conversation sometimes, and this would be kind of maybe the next claim that I would, or the issue I'd want to explore, which is that we grant something like prehension, and then you get this sort of Moat Bailey sort of a thing, that it's sort of like, well, it's just prehension and it's not this sort of consciousness thing, what have you. But then once that's sort of granted, we start getting into these sorts of scientific methodologies that are like, well, but we can see all of the cosmos through the lens of human consciousness. And it's like, well, wait a second, maybe not, for the novelty kind of reasons that I was getting at. But I want to read this quote. Maybe it's a bit long, but I think it will give people a little bit of a better sense of what were really some of the real consequences of this. So this is from your, you sent me this article in let's see, the Journal of Holistic Science, Volume 2, titled Goethe and Whitehead, Steps to a Science of Organism. And it's all about this kind of issue that we're reading. And so this is Whitehead, this is Goethe, and this is you reflecting on them and kind of getting at the implications of this line of thought. Quote, you writing here. Instead of defining the scientific method so as to require the total withdrawal of consciousness from phenomena, or said otherwise, the replacement of phenomena altogether with imperceivable abstract models, and again, that's this issue that we're grappling with here, Goethe and Whitehead alike encourage us to trust our senses. Quote, insofar as we make use of our healthy senses, Goethe claimed, quote, the human being is the most powerful and exact scientific instrument possible, end quote. Rather than severing the appearance of nature from the causal nexus imagined to exist behind appearances, Goethe counsels us not to, quote, go looking for anything beyond phenomena, end quote, for, quote, everything factual is already theory, end quote. Similarly, for Whitehead, quote, natural philosophy should never ask what is in the mind and what is in nature. To do so is a confession that it has failed to express relations between things perceptively known, end quote. Both thinkers sought to heal the incision hewn by modern philosophy between the perceptual and causal domains, which again is this conversation I think that we're really both exploring. In Goethe's terms, quote, theory, pure and simple, is no use except in that it makes us believe in the interconnection of phenomena, end quote. And in Whitehead's terms, the, quote, sole justification, end quote, for any theory is, quote, the elucidation of immediate experience, end quote. Sorry for all these quotes and end quotes, but just want to make sure who's,
I'm sorry.
No, it's good. Elsewhere, Whitehead reiterates that, quote, there is no going behind actual, bracket, occasions of experience to find anything more real, end quote. Nature, for Whitehead, as for Goethe, becomes simply, quote, what we are aware of in perception, end quote. Okay, so that I think is just to give a picture of like the alternative here. Because again, I think we agree on the diagnosis. I think we agree of what the problem is, and that we need to reconnect the human and the phenomenological and the subjective to the cosmos and all that. But then it's like, how do we do that? And then this is a way to do that. And I find it deeply problematic, but I want you to try to, unpack why it's not problematic. So I hear that and I'm like, now, your next paragraph does talk about the potential misunderstandings, and I can read that as well, because you name my concern, which is like, how does this not just become, well, I'm looking at a thing, and so that must be exactly the way it is, there's so many things in perceptual reality that like give themselves to appearance in a particular way, and then we study them more, and we're more rigorous in our methodology, and we try to not be kind of fooled by our senses, and we realize that there's this whole other way of viewing this thing. I mean, does the earth go does the sun go up and down over the course of the day, or does the earth revolve around the sun? Is a classic example of that. And part of the things I'm concerned about in the big picture here, because if we were just arguing about methodology and philosophy, this could just be sort of a abstract conversation, but it does have really huge consequences for our world model, right? Like, does the earth go around the sun or does it not? And it would seem like if we use this methodology, we're going to get different answers to scientific questions, which is part of what I was responding to from that video that you shared about Steiner, which it seemed to be suggesting, heck, is Steiner saying that we live in a geocentric universe? Is the implication of this approach to science a different set of answers to reality that are incredibly different from, a lot of deemed consensus, gains of the scientific community, such as heliocentrism, such as, again, even quantum mechanics and theory of relativity, which are explicitly challenged in this article. So you can see the broad repercussions of this. It's like, do we take the idea of an electron seriously, or do we say, well, I can't see electrons, so they must be just an abstract model? So you can, I think, get my concerns here. So why am I wrong? Why am I overreacting? Or maybe I'm not. I don't know.
Well, I think the history of astronomy is quite edifying here. It's most people know that the Pythagorean astronomers in 4th, 3rd century BCE already had developed a heliocentric conception model. Aristarchus of Samos, I believe, had this sun-centered understanding based on geometry and observations. And there's a sense in which, so there's an anecdote. Do you know this story, Elizabeth Anscombe and Ludwig Wittgenstein talking about this question? More or less,
just from your presentation, yeah. But
okay,
yeah.
But it's like, when you know the heliocentric theory and you observe the motions of the sun and the heavens, it's like, well, it wouldn't look it looks just as it would if that were true, even though, and so it's easy to say, well, the ancients just thought that the senses were giving the true story and that the earth was stationary. But the medieval Europeans thought that, but the ancient Greeks sensed something differently, right? Using mathematics, but mathematics is observational too. We're talking about synthetic a priori knowledge in Kant's terms. There's an intuitive component to mathematics and geometry and arithmetic as well. And so it's not a simple story here to say that like the Copernican revolution is the triumph of mathematics over sensory appearances or something, and that's the vindication of this Platonic story ultimately, right? That we can't trust our senses. But it's not really the vindication of Plato. Plato was also skeptical of mathematical models. There's actually a higher form of knowing beyond mathematical modeling for Plato, which would be noesis, or like direct intuition, participation in the forms. So I think keeping the history of astronomy in mind, it's like there's something else going on when Copernicus reintroduces the heliocentric model in the 15th century. It's not just that all of a sudden, someone was smart enough to realize what's really going on. Like, no, that he was borrowing from Pythagorean astronomy to generate this his own model. And so, I mean, just to be straightforward and answer your question, is Steiner proposing that the Earth is the center of the universe? No, he's quite explicit that the Earth is moving. It's just that rather than decide that the heliocentric is true and the geocentric model is false, I think we have to accept that the nature of space and time and motion is a little bit subtler than either of these models let on, right?
But like, I won't argue with that, obviously. I mean, like, anytime anyone wants to introduce more subtlety, nuance, complexity to an argument, it's like, yeah, usually I'll be like, that's great. But part of actually the genesis of you sharing this presentation and this conversation we're having now ultimately goes back to your critical of the Big Bang model theory, right? So like, this is the kind of consensus model in cosmology. And I could, people do point to a million different aspects of the, evidentiary support for it. But you're like, we shouldn't just, this is deeply problematic as a model. And so part of me is sort of asking you to kind of, lay your cards on the table. Like, what aspects of kind of contemporary cosmology or modern science would you say, no, like, no Big Bang model, no theory of relativity, no theory of quantum mechanics?
No, I mean, I think quantum physics is, I think, essential to a leverage point that I would want to lean on for my own perspective here. But I think the Big Bang model, I mean, first of all, that name was initially pejorative, and the scientific community, when this was first proposed, thought it was a bit too similar to creationism. But I think in the contemporary context, my sense is that yes, there is a lot of institutional weight behind the Big Bang model because scientists need government funding for the big experiments that cost billions of dollars, whether it's space telescopes or particle colliders or whatever, to continue their professional pursuits, right? And that's not at all to knock scientists for wanting to pursue their professional pursuits. It's just to acknowledge that science happens in an institutional context. And when you're dealing with human institutions, there's all sorts of ways in which we can become captured and become self-perpetuating rather than being truly driven, as we would hope all scientists are. And I know as individuals, most of them, most scientists are driven by the pursuit of truth. And I'm very interested in what seems to be an increasing number of astrophysicists, astronomers, scientists involved in studying outer space who are concerned. And they're publishing in mainstream journals expressing these concerns. And the James Webb Space Telescope is precipitating an increased awareness of some of these problems. Galaxies that are much more organized and larger earlier in the universe's history, according to the Big Bang model, than we would have expected.
Right. But that's all based on, like, it seems like your critique, though, is based on a profound fundamental philosophical objection. So it's not like, hey, the Webb telescope finds some findings that, challenge a prevailing theory of galaxy formation. It's like, no, we should be using the human as the instrument of scientific knowing. And so I feel like it's a little bit, again, sort of Mote and Bailey I don't know, there's like a bait and switch going on here. It's like, I'm curious to kind of like really get a sense of what are the implications of really taking this methodology seriously.
Well, it's a problem of the relationship between fact or observation and theory, right? When we talk about the expansion of the universe, often it's put forward as a fact. But what do we actually observe?
Well, we observe redshift.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. So Doppler effect, assuming.
And you're.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I don't.
And you're aware, and you're aware. I mean, maybe you're aware, maybe you're not, of the fact that when we look at different lights in the sky, stars, galaxies, there are various examples, dozens of examples of quasars or stars or galaxies which are redshifted in a way that doesn't align with the idea that objects that we know are further away would be more redshifted than others. There are plenty of counterexamples of that, right? And so that seems to be disconfirming evidence of this idea. Now, the problem is that we observe redshift and we immediately, because this model is so dominant, leap to the theoretical interpretation, which is expansion of space. There are other theoretical explanations of redshift.
Well, but two things though. One is you'd made the point earlier that actually the Big Bang model was criticized when people first initially, thought about it that way. So if anything, it had to overcome a lot of challenges in order to become that consensus. And two, it's not just redshift. There's the cosmic microwave background radiation as well. And a number of other confluent evidentiary aspects that together are they make a gestalt of like, oh, okay, this seems to be the case that this has been going on like this. And then of course in the Einstein equations and whatnot, but yeah.
But when you look at the history of this model, rather than this model predicting what would be observed, very often the model is such that there are so many free parameters, things you can adjust mathematically in light of new observations, that rather than being predictive, the physicist Tim Eastman likes to say, well, the Big Bang model is postdictive, which is to say, well, you can go in after the fact and tinker with the mathematics of the model to make it fit what's observed.
Yeah.
And, okay, everything's fine. And at a cosmological scale, it's very difficult to do normal science because we can't rewind the clock. We can't experiment on the universe as a whole, right? And so on some level, like, I'm not blaming, contemporary physicists, astrophysicists for the situation. Is kind of inevitable, but I do worry about the public pronouncements and the degree to which almost always the difference between theory and observation is conflated, such that it's the Big Bang. The Big Bang is considered just a done deal.
Well,
I will say that I think is very unlikely to be changed is the idea of a time developmental universe. Mm-hmm. But I do have pretty foundational philosophical questions about what we might even mean by the beginning of space and time.
Yeah, that's what I mean, though. That's what I'm intrigued by. Is there's this sort of shift in scale when we get into the details here, because like if you were just like, hey everyone, I think the Big Bang model is overrated, look at all this sort of anomalous information we should take seriously, etc., like people do that, and you can do that entirely within a consensus framing of modern contemporary science, using all of the stuff that deeper down actually though you're criticizing. Like you're critiquing not just a given model, you're critiquing models. And that's the thing that I'm trying to probe. So when I probe into this, like what needs to go, what needs to jettison, and then I feel like we wind up switching into the level of, well, here's the argument against this and that, but it's like, what's the argument against models itself is a much more it's a much deeper philosophical issue, and that to me is where I get concerned about the implications of jettisoning models.
Well, I think in the history of science there is a very significant change that happens after Copernicus. If you read, Ptolemaic astronomers or Ptolemy himself, the idea that the model, the geocentric model, was how the heavens actually moved, it was not considered. This is the way God does it is beyond us, right? This is a model that works because it's highly accurate for making predictions, and there was no need for Ptolemaic astronomers to collapse that distinction between model and reality. There was more humility about that. And I think after Copernicus and Descartes and Newton, that humility goes out the window, and it's like, no, the model is the way nature is, right? And that's a step that I think we should reconsider. Models can teach us a lot. They can be highly predictive. I mean, until Kepler and Newton fixed Copernicus's model a little bit by adding elliptical orbits and some other things, the Ptolemaic model was way more accurate, right? And so when we're dealing with model centrism in science, it's not that models as such are bad, or that I would in any way want to discourage scientists from pursuing the construction of more accurate models, in the sense that they provide more accurate predictions of what we do observe. But to explain a natural phenomenon in terms of an abstract model is to put the cart before the horse. And here I'm very Whiteheadian and I'm very Goethean, and this might be a point of divergence between us. I don't think that something abstract can explain concrete experience.
Sure.
Ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're going to actually understand what science is telling us, we're going to need to render it in terms of our concrete experience, in terms that makes sense to our perceptual
this is
lives.
the thing. I think this is what's really interesting is, okay, so let me see if I can communicate this. So the model, I totally agree. And I think anyone who's using a model knows that this isn't the thing. It's a model. It's an abstract, theoretical notion. Now, I don't argue with the fact that some people will fail to make that distinction. They'll be like, yes, here it is. And then
many popularizers of science don't. But yeah.
But now here's I think the difference that I would make is that the model, it fails because the reality is often something that we cannot understand. And so what the model is doing is translating between what we can understand and an aspect of reality that we can't, and giving us a sort of like model to make that distinction. Now, what I interpret a lot of this line of argumentation that you're espousing is saying the model is bad, not because it does that, but because we should be able to understand it. And if we can't, then it's not real. And there's a very different reason for critiquing models in that sense, right? For example, the Bohr model, right, of the atom. We know that that's wrong. We still teach it because it's a nice sort of, you bring up Wittgenstein, he's got the ladder that, you throw away and the light of children and all that sort of thing. There's a pedagogical value or utility in having false models sometimes that you can then transcend. But we know that that's not how it works, but it's still a kind of like, it gets us a little closer to understanding it, right? But so no one's going to say, yes, here is an atom and here's how it works. But rather than saying, well, see, actually atoms have these clouds and they can't really fully, or I'm sorry, electrons have these clouds and it's probabilistic function that we can't really fully wrap our heads around. So we use a model. I get what you're saying as being like, no, if we're saying that we can't wrap our heads around it ultimately, then it can't be real. And that's problematic to me.
It's not just about wrapping our heads around it. Because in a way, this model centrism is very head centric. Also, it's like an intellectualizing effort to explain nature in terms of abstractions, which is very valuable. I mean, I'm addicted to doing that. But I also think that there's more to human experience than just this pursuit of intellectualized abstractions. We have hearts and we have limbs. Like it's the head, but the hands and the heart. I mean, this is something that followers of Steiner are always harping on. That like we need a knowledge that's embodied in a way, and understanding ourselves as cosmic beings means recognizing that however the universe is doing what it's doing, and it's going to involve more than just a process that we would understand mathematically. Obviously, the universe is not just numbers crunching themselves, right? As I've said. And in our own experience, we have these other domains, these other layers of our experience, like feeling, like willing. Where does that fit into our picture? Where do these other domains of human experience, which are very real for us and undeniable if we're going to do anything social or, not much less civilized, like agency and feeling, a sense of intersubjective resonance, like these are essential things. And I think we need to understand, to be fully naturalistic in a sense, how do we naturalize these layers of our human experience to understand them as part of the universe as well.
I guess I just disagree with trying to answer that by making them fundamental, right? I think it's a category error to look at a rock and be like, well, I experience will, and I know that, and I feel it, and that needs to be accounted for then in everything else in reality. So therefore, there's some inchoate sense of will in a rock. It's like, that's a misapplication, and it is, I think, kind of anthropocentric to do that move. So then it's like, I have no problem by saying, well, wills emerge in the course of culture of cosmic evolution, that we don't always have to find the various phenomena that we see in reality at every scale, that some phenomena really are genuinely novel at new scales, and that we can expect that there will be other scales in which that transcend my human limitations in a way that we should also allow for. So there's also a kind of imposition on anything that could transcend us by thinking in these terms, if you want to look at it that way.
But that, a rock is a fragment of a planetary body. And that planetary body is an expression of a multi-billion year process of cosmic evolution and profound transformations in the organization of matter and energy. And like, obviously a rock isn't an agent in any helpful, it's not helpful to describe a rock as an agent. But the Earth as a whole, I think we could start to have more interesting conversations about the degree to which, Earth system science or Gaia theory, or if you want to refer to it, either way, it's that the Earth as a whole is this kind of self-organizing system that's expressing agency and on some level. And so, everyone's always throwing rocks at panpsychists, and I get
literally,
it.
I guess in this case, or conceptually, maybe figuratively, they're throwing figurative rocks.
Yeah. So, but I don't want to give the impression that I think there is a quick and easy answer to life, the universe, and everything that we access intuitively. No, absolutely not. There's a ton of scientific research yet to be done, even if we do switch modes and engage. And it's not switching modes; it's a both and thing. But if we do take seriously the possibility of a qualitative science, an intuitive, participatory science, we have a shit ton to learn using that methodology. It's not like it's just what first meets the eye is what's true, and like we have it, we don't need to do any more inquiry or questioning. Absolutely not. Right. So it's still a methodology to pursue what we don't know yet. Right. And there's always more than meets the eye. And so to take perception seriously is not to say that, our immediate perception is what's true. We have to change our orientation, our altitude, our way of engaging with the phenomena to bring forth new perceptions, and then think about how these different percepts are related to one another. When Goethe says that fact is already theory, what he means is that when we come up with theories, what we really want to be doing is assembling and synthesizing as many facts as we possibly can, so that we don't have any anomalous facts that don't fit with the theory, rather than coming up with the abstract theory and trying to get the facts to conform to it. He's trying to reverse that.
Well, I want to throw this in before we close, because for me, it's very satisfactory to look at it through a Piagetian lens, right? Which is basically to share the agreement that there is an embodied route to sort of hypothetico, mathematico, deductive reasoning, and sort of like, abstract logic comes from the body, that when you're a kid in the sensory motor phase and you're moving things around and you move this over here, and you move this over here, there's like implicit addition that sort of becomes internalized in the process. And that through the developmental process, we learn over time causality, we learn necessity, we learn I dare to use the word mechanism again, but like, the conservation of a liquid when you put it into from a fat small beaker to a thin tall one, like you realize that there are multiple things that are being accounted for and having a kind of a compensatory effect on each other. And then you learn to complexify the mind, and you learn that implicit in all that is there's this sort of conservation factor, which is, core to mathematics and the notion of, a balanced ledger and all this stuff. So the notion that abstract mathematical logic emerges from embodiment and from action, I think is real and crucial. But I think there's just a different accounting for it. And again, I think it comes down to like, that's a constructivist evolutionary developmental angle, whereas it seems like another approach would be to posit as fundamental certain things that we want to see to bridge the human cosmos divide. This was again a sort of a big hang up I had with cosmoerotic humanism to try to solve the field of value question. It was like, rather than see that value is implicit in evolution and organisms to maintain themselves, and that consciousness itself, it's implicit in that because of valence and all this stuff, it's just, no, value exists in the world as sort of a given. And it's like, well, wait a second, what about all of modernity and postmodernity? What about all of the new ways of conceiving of these things and challenging sort of implicit value? So that's my hang up for around a lot of this is what we posit as fundamental is often what needs to be explained or what has already been challenged. And I'm wary of trying to solve the problem which we agree needs to be solved, the alienation of the individual from the cosmos, by basically just saying, well, the individual is primary, and the cosmos can be understood in terms of the individual, rather than putting the individual in the cosmos and then trying to understand how we emerged out of the cosmos, and yet also are the cosmos itself, having emerged, being able to sort of reflect on itself and understand ourselves through the cosmos. That would be how I would kind of frame some of this, and hopefully I didn't misrepresent anyone in the process. But yeah, concluding thoughts. We should probably wrap this up for the sake of our audience's attention spans. But yeah, I'll give you the final word on any of this.
So I would say there's a thesis antithesis synthesis thing that I would want to leave people with, as I see it, that the ancient cosmologies are the thesis, modernity is the antithesis. Postmodernity, I think, is really more like hypermodernity in this construal, more alienation, more sense of disembedding and being freed from, which comes with certain boons, but freed from any sense of a given reality that we must conform to. And the synthesis would be not returning to the ancient understanding and jettisoning some sense of value pluralism at the cultural and social level, which is absolutely, I mean, I think would want to affirm that as important. But to recognize that value is not simply a subjective construct is essential for the synthesis that we're trying to pull off. We don't want to impose on people, but I think there's also I'm increasingly concerned about relativism and nihilism, and we need to pull off a synthesis here whereby we recognize that value is not something we make up. Meaning is something we have a role to play, a participatory role to play in generating, but there's certain material we're always working with when we generate that meaning, and that material is already drenched in meaning, and we can't make that meaning in a vacuum. We can't make it just ex nihilo, right? And so we have to reconnect with, on some level, in some way, this ancient cosmological sense of living in a cosmos which is value imbued from the get-go, but in a way that welcomes us as creative participants in the ongoing creation of that value. So, I mean, that would be just the big picture meta-historical narrative that I would want to tell and leave people with. And in broad brushstrokes, I think, we're totally working on the same project here. And it would take many more hours to work out all the details, but hopefully we made a little bit of progress here.
Yeah, definitely. No, I was just going to say, like, well, one, thank you so much for your time. And I value the work that you're doing. I think, yeah, I mean, rather than just sing all your praises, though, you're a great thinker, though. And I appreciate, being able to have the opportunity to dig into some of this stuff, because you and I, but also you and I and a group and a number of other groups are tackling the same issue. And I think are working with a shared number of, well, what do we want to call them? Not presuppositions per se, because I don't want to say that we're predetermining the outcome, but we have a sense that certain things make sense. And then we need to get some clarity around how and why they are the case. And I think I'm seeing this flowering of different sort of answers to the shared problem set. And these conversations are sort of part of, let's get together, share, debate, get into the nitty gritty, because I think this is going to be more and more valuable going forward to get some clarity. Now that we're sort of on the same page, it's sort of like, how do we get a sense of what the different possible solution sets are that people are that people are advocating, and explore them, and like what are the potential downsides, pros and cons to all these different approaches, and get clarity about it. So thank you for taking the time, and I consider you leading figure in doing this work. So anyway, Matt Segall, much appreciated.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, and right back at you, and I hope to continue this.
Sounds good.